I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you have to do 58 hours of backbreaking labor.
Which is, I mean, that's a whole work week plus overtime.
Right. We were talking nonstop foraging, chopping wood, hauling heavy timber, and all of that effort is just to earn enough energy to run a single modern household light bulb for exactly 1 hour.
It's just a staggering baseline to measure our progress against.
Yeah, I mean, that is what it took for our prehistoric ancestors to get the equivalent of 1 hour of modern light.
And even if you fast forward a bit to Babylonian times, so like 1750 BCE,
Okay.
even then, burning sesame oil in a lamp only brought that energy cost down to about 41 hours of work.
Wow, still almost a full week of labor for 1 hour of light.
Exactly. But today, it takes the average person a fraction of a single second of labor to afford that exact same hour of light.
A fraction of a second. I mean, when you flick on a switch, the cost doesn't even register for you. But that massive mind-bending shift from 58 hours to a fraction of a second, it isn't just a story about technology getting better.
Right. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah, so today we're doing a deep dive into Andrew Leigh's book, The Shortest History of Economics. And what becomes immediately clear is that human progress isn't just this neat linear tech tree.
No.
It's more like this constant underlying tug of war between the drive to innovate and, well, the temptation to just hoard everything.
Yeah, that tension is basically the hidden engine of human history.
Right.
Economics is essentially the study of how we navigate scarcity, right?
Right.
It's about the mechanisms we build to either share resources or exploit them. And when you look at history through that specific lens, you start to see the hidden architecture behind literally everything.
It's wild. Like, we're going to get into how ancient farming tools mapped out modern gender norms and why the Spanish Empire inadvertently destroyed itself by bringing home too much gold.
Which is such a fascinating paradox.
It really is. So to understand how we got out of the woods and into the modern economy, we have to start with the foundational wedge that drove progress, which is job specialization.
Yes, the division of labor.
Right. Like, why don't we make our own light bulbs anymore? Or, to use an incredibly vivid example from the book, why don't we make our own toasters?
Well, because rejecting specialization is just a total exercise in futility. There's this designer, Thomas Thwaites, who actually attempted this.
Okay, I love this story.
It's brilliant. He set out to build a completely basic pop-up toaster from scratch, like absolutely no buying pre-made parts.
So no hardware store runs?
None. He wanted to personally source and process every single raw material required for standard toaster.
And a standard toaster has, what, like 400 different components?
Something like that, yeah.
You've got plastics, nickel, iron, mica. How do you even begin to do that as one person?
With great, great difficulty. I mean, he traveled to a disused mine in England to physically dig up iron ore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he got copper from whales.
Yeah.
He tried to build a homemade blast furnace to process the iron, which,
Let me guess, it completely failed.
completely failed. So he resorted to trying to smelt iron ore in a domestic microwave.
Wait, in a microwave?
Yes. And for the casing, he literally melted down household garbage to try and mold it into plastic.
That is insane. So what was the final tally for this whole experiment?
Well, it took him 9 months of constant labor.
9 months for a toaster.
Yeah. And if you calculate his time at the average UK wage at the time, the labor cost was roughly £20,000.
20,000 pounds. For a toaster you can buy at a retail store for like £4.
Exactly. And the best part, when he finally plugged it in, the element glowed for exactly 5 seconds before the entire contraption just melted into a useless heap.
5 seconds. Oh, man.
But it's the ultimate proof, right? Modern wealth relies entirely on our ability to focus on what we do best and just trade for the rest.
Right.
We see this at a macro level today with entire manufacturing ecosystems. Like the Chinese city of Yiwu produces the vast majority of the world's Christmas decorations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and Taizhou serves as a global hub for manufacturing intelligent toilets. We divide the labor, and the aggregate efficiency just skyrockets.
I've always thought of it like a human Swiss Army knife.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like if you try to be completely self-sufficient and do everything yourself, you end up with a finicky little knife, annoyingly tiny scissors, and a totally impractical screwdriver.
Exactly. You can survive, but you definitely can't build a civilization that way.
Specialization fixes that. But for specialization to work, you need a mechanism to coordinate all those different people. You need incentives.
And incentives are basically the invisible strings pulling human behavior. And they often work in ways that policymakers completely fail to anticipate.
Oh, definitely.
Take Australia in 2004, for example. The government introduced a massive baby bonus for children born on or after July 1st of that year.
The intent being just to boost the overall birth rate, I assume?
Yes, just a straightforward financial incentive to have kids. But the immediate effect was this massive, statistically impossible spike in births exactly on July 1st.
Wait, they actually timed it.
Oh, yeah. Expectant mothers and their doctors actively delayed inductions and scheduled C-sections to ensure the birth happened after the midnight deadline so they can secure the financial reward.
That is wild.
And the exact same behavioral shift happened in the United States regarding inheritance taxes.
Hmm.
When the estate tax rates were scheduled to change, the timing of deaths actually shifted around the legislative deadline.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Are economists actually arguing that humans are just these greedy, calculating machines who will literally time their own deaths or delay childbirth just to maximize a utility function? Because that feels like a terribly cynical view of human nature.
It does sound cynical, and it's actually a very common critique of classical economics.
Mm.
But it's an incomplete picture. The field isn't just about pure self-interest.
Right.
Look at the work of Elinor Ostrom. She is the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. Her entire body of research actually counters the idea that humans are doomed to selfishly deplete resources.
Oh, interesting. What does she find?
Well, she studied communities globally, from fisheries in Indonesia to communal forests in Nepal. And she proved that humans naturally design complex, cooperative institutions to manage scarce resources.
So we figure out how to share.
Exactly. We aren't just greedy calculators, we are really sophisticated cooperators.
Which perfectly brings us to the ultimate cooperative shift, which is the agricultural revolution.
Yeah.
Moving from nomadic hunter-gatherer bands to settled farming societies, it's often painted as this triumphant leap forward for humanity, but the reality was far more complicated.
Very complicated. We have to establish the baseline of pre-farming life first. Thomas Hobbes famously described it as nasty, brutish, and short, and the archaeological record actually largely supports him.
It's rough.
Extremely. Forensic data shows infant mortality hovered around 40%, and up to 15% of people in nomadic societies died violently, either from conflict or predation.
Wow. So there's that fascinating exception of the Kung people near the Kalahari Desert.
Right. The Mongongo nuts.
Yeah. They relied on mongongo nuts, which are incredibly dense in protein and fat, and essentially rot-proof. And when a researcher asked why they didn't farm, a Kung tribesman literally replied, "Why should we plant crops when there are so many mongongo nuts in the world?"
I mean, you can't argue with that logic. They won the geographic lottery.
Totally. But for most of humanity, seasonal starvation was a persistent, terrifying threat.
Right. And agriculture solved this through what economists call consumption smoothing.
Consumption smoothing.
Yeah. By cultivating grains that could be stored indefinitely, humans could finally hedge against the winter or a bad hunting season. And the surpluses generated by this led to some astonishing early societies.
Like the Indus Valley civilization.
Exactly. Running from about 3300 to 1300 BCE, they had advanced urban planning, they had sophisticated plumbing, and actual flush toilets.
Flush toilets in 3300 BCE. That blows my mind.
It's incredible. They even standardized the ratio of their building bricks to 1 to 2 to 4, which is a structurally optimal dimension that we literally still use today.
And what's striking about the Indus Valley is the apparent lack of massive palaces or giant monuments.
Right.
Like, you don't see a great pyramid or a sprawling acropolis, which suggests it was a society that managed to generate an agricultural surplus without immediately falling into massive wealth inequality.
Which is a very rare historical anomaly, unfortunately.
Right, because that anomaly highlights the central paradox of the agricultural revolution. If farming gave us reliable calories, flush toilets, and standardized construction, why does the skeletal data unequivocally show that average human heights plummeted by about 4 inches after we adopted agriculture?
4 whole inches.
Yeah, why did we shrink?
Because the tug of war between innovation and exploitation began the very moment we had surplus grain. Think about it. In a nomadic society, you can only own what you can physically carry.
Which enforces a sort of natural egalitarianism.
Precisely. But once you have silos of grain, you have static wealth. And static wealth can be hoarded, it can be guarded, and it can be stolen. Surpluses inevitably created the warlord.
So it was a caloric trap. You have more food overall, but the quality of life for the median person just collapses.
Exactly. Early farmers relied on a really narrow band of starchy crops. which drastically reduced dietary diversity compared to foragers.
Right.
Plus, they lived in these dense, unsanitary settlements right alongside their livestock, which created perfect incubators for zoonotic diseases. And those new warlords we mentioned, they evolved into despots.
Yeah.
The stability of a surplus actually brought massive political instability. Over a 500-year period in the Roman Empire, there were 77 emperors, and roughly half of them were assassinated.
That is a terrible track record. So the median human essentially traded dietary diversity and a taller stature for infectious disease, a lifetime of back-breaking repetitive labor, and the privilege of being taxed by a violent autocrat.
Put like that, it sounds awful.
Hmm.
And in the short term, it was a terrible deal for the individual. But on a macro level, it was the only way forward. The surplus meant that for the first time in human history, a small percentage of the population didn't have to spend all their days looking for calories. It created the breathing room for a dedicated class of artisans, engineers, and thinkers.
Specialization again.
Exactly.
And the tools that those early innovators created didn't just change how we farmed, they permanently rewired our social structures. I mean, the plow is the perfect example here.
It really is.
Before the plow, farming relied on the digging stick. It's an effective tool that doesn't require immense physical strength, making agriculture a relatively gender-neutral activity.
But the introduction of the animal-drawn plow fundamentally altered that dynamic.
Right.
Controlling heavy oxen and wrestling a plowshare through dense soil requires significant upper body strength.
Right.
So that single technological shift transitioned agriculture into a heavily male-dominated sphere, which pushed women primarily into domestic roles.
And the cultural echo of that shift is just astounding. The data in the book shows that even today, in modern industrial economies, immigrants who originate from cultures with a historical legacy of plow agriculture hold significantly more restrictive views on whether women should participate in the workforce.
It's wild to think about.
Right. An ancient piece of farming technology is literally still dictating office dynamics and social norms thousands of years later.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply economic constraints embed themselves into our cultural DNA. And geography played a similarly deterministic role. Jared Diamond's hypothesis regarding continental axes is crucial here.
Oh, right, the east-west versus north-south thing.
Yeah. Eurasia is oriented on an east-west axis, meaning it is wide. But the Americas and Africa are oriented north-south. They are tall.
Which dictates the spread of that crucial agricultural technology. If you travel east to west across Eurasia, you remain in relatively similar climatic bands. The day lengths are identical, the seasonal cycles align. So a strain of wheat domesticated in the Fertile Crescent can thrive thousands of miles away in Europe or Asia.
Conversely, traveling north to south means traversing wildly different ecological zones. You move from temperate climates to tropics to arid deserts.
Right, you can't just plant an alpine crop in the jungle.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot simply take a staple crop or a farming technique from the Andes and easily adapt it to the climate of Mesoamerica. Eurasia's horizontal layout allowed agricultural innovations to spread laterally at incredible speeds.
Which compounded wealth and population density.
Yes, which ultimately translated into the military and economic dominance that drove global colonization.
But having a geographic advantage and a class of innovators doesn't guarantee progress.
Right.
We see these ancient empires hit an innovation wall. The Romans had breathtaking engineering. I mean, they built the Pantheon, they built massive aqueduct networks.
They were brilliant engineers.
But they completely ignored highly effective labor-saving technologies like the watermill. If they had the engineers, why completely ignore a machine that could exponentially increase your output?
This reveals a very dark economic reality about the nature of capital and labor. Innovation is driven by the necessity to reduce costs, right?
Sure.
Well, in ancient Rome, and similarly in ancient Egypt and imperial China, the cost of labor was artificially suppressed to near zero because of widespread slavery. When a ruling class has access to tens of thousands of enslaved people, the financial incentive to invest in efficiency completely evaporates.
Because you don't build a machine to do the work of 50 men if you can simply force 50 men to do it for free.
Precisely. The brutality of slavery wasn't just a moral catastrophe. It was a massive anchor dragging down human progress. Capital investment in labor-saving technology only happens when labor is expensive enough to justify the upfront cost.
Which proves the thesis perfectly. The temptation to exploit completely paralyzed the drive to innovate. But eventually, trade expanded, and moving that agricultural surplus required infrastructure and financial mechanisms that shifted power once again.
Transporting goods over land was prohibitively expensive and slow, even long after the wheel was invented. Water transport was the true lifeblood of early empires.
Like China's Grand Canal.
Exactly. Built during the Sui dynasty. It was a 1,000-mile artificial waterway connecting the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. By the year 1000, the sheer volume of commerce flowing through that canal made the average Chinese citizen considerably wealthier than their European counterparts.
But complex trade networks require a standardized ledger. They require money. And looking at the history of currency completely shatters our modern assumptions.
It really does.
We think of the Greek silver drachma, something
Well,
tangible. But on the Micronesian island of Yap, the currency consisted of massive limestone discs, some of them 12 feet across.
the race stones. They are so fascinating because they decouple the concept of money from physical exchange.
Right. You couldn't exactly put a 12-foot stone in your pocket. When a transaction occurred, the stone never physically moved. The entire village just updated a shared mental ledger of who currently owned it.
Yep.
There's even that famous story of a stone that fell off a boat and sank to the bottom of the ocean, but the islanders still traded it because they all agreed it still existed down there.
It sounds absurd until you realize that is exactly how the global financial system operates today.
Right, like central banks.
Absolutely. When central banks clear international settlements, they don't load bullion onto cargo ships. The gold bars sit completely stationary in subterranean vaults in New York or London, and a digital ledger simply reassigns ownership.
The Yap Islanders effectively invented the conceptual framework of modern banking centuries ago.
They really did. And as those banking systems evolved in port cities, we see another massive leap in social mobility. Venice is the prime example here with the invention of the Caliganta.
The Kaliganza.
Yes, it was revolutionary. It was an early form of a joint stock venture or a risk-sharing contract. A wealthy investor would provide the capital for a maritime trading voyage, and a less wealthy working-class merchant would take the physical risk of sailing.
And then they would split the profits.
Exactly. It meant that a commoner with no inherited wealth, but a willingness to take risks, could climb the economic ladder. It transformed Venice into the wealthiest commercial hub in the Mediterranean.
But then the Venetian elites did what entrenched power always does. They felt threatened by this rising class of newly wealthy merchants, and they literally legislated the ladder away.
Yes, the Serrata, or the Great Lockout of 1297. The established patrician families passed laws restricting membership in the Great Council, which was the governing body of Venice, only to those whose ancestors had already served on it.
They just closed the door.
They closed off the political and economic systems entirely just to protect their monopolies.
They sacrificed the economic dynamism of their entire republic just to ensure their own families wouldn't have to compete.
And the result was stagnation. When you remove competition, growth dies. And this applies across all human institutions. The data even shows this pattern in religion, oddly enough.
Oh, how so?
If you look at church attendance in the United States, where there is a massive free market of thousands of competing denominations, participation is vastly higher than in Scandinavian countries, which historically maintain state-sponsored religious monopolies. Monopoly breeds complacency.
And it entrenches inequality. We see this quantified in the Great Gatsby curve, right?
Yes, exactly.
The economic principle that as income inequality widens within a society, generational social mobility plummets. It becomes impossible to climb the rungs.
Right.
You can literally track this through rare surnames. Over centuries, names like Pepys in England, Cax in the US, or traditional samurai lineages in Japan persistently dominate elite professions like law and medicine. The wealth just locks in.
It does. Unless the system is violently broken. Sometimes the tug-of-war isn't shifted by a new invention, but by a massive exogenous shock.
Like the bubonic plague. The Black Death hits Europe in 1347 and wipes out roughly a third of the population. In major hubs like Cairo, the mortality rate approached 50%. The human toll is unimaginable, but the economic shockwave completely rewrote the balance of power.
It really did. The immediate consequence of a third of the population dying was a sudden, extreme labor shortage. The ratio of land to labor completely inverted.
Land was abundant, but workers were incredibly scarce.
Exactly.
But wait, if I am a surviving medieval feudal lord and labor is scarce, I don't sit down at the bargaining table and offer higher wages. I am a lord. I use my knights to force the peasants to work the fields under threat of violence. Why didn't the elites just violently enforce the status quo?
Oh, they absolutely tried. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which explicitly made it illegal to demand or pay wages higher than pre-plague levels.
But it didn't work.
It completely failed because market forces overwhelmed military coercion. The lords were desperate to harvest their crops, so they began secretly outbidding each other, poaching peasants from neighboring estates. The workers suddenly had leverage, and they used it to demand cash wages instead of forced labor.
So the plague effectively broke the back of feudalism. Because wages doubled, the surviving working class suddenly had disposable income.
Yes.
They started buying meat and beer, which shifted the entire agricultural sector away from basic grain cultivation and toward livestock and specialized trades.
The grim irony is that a catastrophic pandemic inadvertently laid the economic groundwork for the European middle class.
But that newfound European wealth eventually funded the Age of Sail. And as maritime technology advanced, with the astrolabe, the lateen sail, and deepwater hulls, that drive to explore rapidly devolved into the most brutal exploitation in human history.
Yes. The Columbian Exchange connected the hemispheres. Europe gained high-yield crops like potatoes and maize, while introducing devastating pathogens like smallpox to the Americas, which decimated indigenous populations.
Right.
And this catastrophic demographic collapse in the Americas created a massive demand for agricultural labor to work the new cash crop plantations.
Which brings us to the transatlantic slave trade. And it's important to state here, we are just conveying the historical realities presented in the source material. The sheer scale of the atrocity is difficult to comprehend.
It is.
Over 12 million human beings trafficked from Africa, a staggering mortality rate just during the Middle Passage. And in markets like New Orleans, 80% of families were intentionally separated during sale.
It was the industrialization of human suffering for pure economic yield. And the wealth generated from forced labor on sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations was immense. By the late 18th century, the profits connected to slaveholding accounted for roughly 5% of the British national income. That capital influx played a massive role in financing the early stages of the British Industrial Revolution.
And you see this same ruthless extraction strategy play out with the Spanish Empire, but with a completely different economic consequence.
Yes, the silver.
Right. The Spanish are pulling tens of thousands of tons of silver out of mines in Mexico and Potosi in Bolivia. The English pirate Francis Drake famously raids a Spanish galleon and steals 26 tons of silver, becoming a national hero in Britain.
But the irony of Francis Drake's piracy is that the silver he failed to steal, the silver that actually made it back to Spain, is what ultimately destroyed the Spanish economy.
The influx of massive amounts of precious metals ruined them. Walk us through the mechanics of that. How does becoming unimaginably rich destroy your economy?
It is the textbook definition of the resource curse, specifically manifesting as massive inflation.
Okay.
In the 16th century, gold and silver weren't just backing the currency, they were the currency. When Spain flooded its domestic market with a tsunami of new silver from the Americas, the velocity and supply of money vastly outpaced the actual production of goods and services.
Ah, so the value of the silver itself plummeted because it was no longer scarce.
Exactly. This caused the Spanish price revolution. The cost of everyday goods skyrocketed. And because domestic prices were so high, it became incredibly expensive to manufacture anything within Spain.
So they couldn't export anything.
Right. Andalusian textile mills, shipbuilders, agricultural producers, they couldn't compete with cheaper imports from the rest of Europe. Their domestic industries completely collapsed. In 1500, Spain was an economic titan. By 1700, by simply extracting wealth rather than innovating, they had hollowed themselves out into an economic backwater.
Wow. It all comes back to that tug of war. The Venetians pulled up the ladder and stagnated. The Spanish extracted silver instead of building industries and bankrupted themselves. The Romans relied on enslaved labor and completely missed the industrial potential of the watermill.
It's a recurring theme.
Economics isn't just a record of stock markets and GDP. It is the invisible architecture that governs human behavior. It is the reason we shrank 4 inches to secure a grain surplus, and the reason it takes a fraction of a second to afford an hour of light today.
And understanding that history provides a crucial framework for looking at the future. We can look back and clearly identify how the Black Death broke feudalism, or how the physical demands of the plow wired our gender norms. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question. What is our modern plow?
Oh, I like that. You mean like What technology is currently rewiring our social structures in ways we won't fully understand for centuries?
Precisely. Consider artificial intelligence. Is it just a labor-saving tool, or is it an entirely new paradigm that will fundamentally alter the value of human cognition, much like the plow altered the value of upper body strength?
Right.
Will AI create an unprecedented era of cooperative surplus, or will it create a new form of digital feudalism, where a tiny elite pulls up the ladder and hoards the immense productivity gains?
That is a fascinating and honestly slightly terrifying lens to view the next decade through. Are we building the next watermill, or are we the Venetian elites locking the council doors? Definitely something for you to ponder the next time you casually flick on a light switch and enjoy the cheapest photons in human history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden machinery of our past. We'll see you next time.